This is a New Hampshire Public Television special presentation. The New Hampshire Political Library and the New England Council present Politics and Eggs, the 2007 Candidate Series, with Connecticut Senator Christopher Dodd, with support from BAE Systems, Clean Harbors Environmental Services, and Fidelity Investments.
Good morning. Welcome to another installment of the New Hampshire Political Library and New England Council's Politics and Eggs Presidential Candidate Series. We are pleased to co-produce this event with the New England Council, and thanks especially to Jim Brett, the President, and Larry Zabar, the Vice President, for a seamless partnership that brings a great many presidential candidates to New Hampshire over the course of the next several months. We cannot do this programming without the sponsors who support each and every event. Their names are on the table cards in front of you, and their banners are flying throughout the room. We'd like to especially welcome to the family this morning Comcast as a new sponsor, thanks to Chris Hodgson and John Marr. Thanks also to McLean, Graff, Rollison, and Middleton, and Greg Smith is here. And also to National Grid, Bill Sherry is here as well. This is the kind of corporate community that values seriously the opportunity to talk one-on-one to presidential candidates coming through New Hampshire. It is a real pleasure to welcome the senior senator from Connecticut. A true New England son, he comes from a large family, and his father, Thomas J. Dodd, was the lead prosecutor in the Nuremberg trials before a distinguished career in the United States Senate himself. If any of you were commuting yesterday, Senator Dodd could be heard on an obligatory appearance on MSNBC's Imus in the Morning, dishing it out as much as the talk show host was giving grief. And Imus is out sick this morning, so I don't know what that means. But your mention of your trip to New Hampshire and the importance of the New Hampshire primary was very much appreciated and heard by a great many people here. You are a senior statesman, having served in the Senate since 1981. You chaired the Democratic National Committee in the mid-90s, and perhaps you could lend your insight into the current DNC's apparent desire to keep you candidates on airplanes during the month of January, and moreover, the seeming desire to have every other state hold its primary, a true national primary, on February 5th. This is exactly the sort of thing that we were concerned about when the schedule began to be tinkered with. All we can do is provide that welcome mat to the presidential candidates that come through this state and prove to the country that this is where a true dialogue goes on with real people and real issues. So the situation isn't good for anyone, not for us and not for the candidates. So we look forward to your comments about the value of campaigning in New Hampshire. Mark Halpern and his note takers at ABC News joked about our Secretary of State Bill Gardner's holiday toast at New Year's with the national media. Well, I think the joke is going to go even further. The holidays are very special here in New Hampshire. Columbus Day and Thanksgiving hold special meaning for a great many of us. And so, Senator Dodd, we sincerely welcome you to New Hampshire. Your breadth of experience and stated positions on the issues are very much apparent, both in the media and other publication. Often quoted as saying, the best social program is a good job, you are also on the record with good work, legislation, and committee leadership. A chair of the Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee, you have advocated a proactive federal budget policy. Complex issues around investor and consumer protection and the need for transparency in corporate governance rings particularly true here in New Hampshire. You have stated that maintaining a manufacturing economy in the 21st century is not a contradiction in terms, and that kind of economy is so very important here in New Hampshire. Work in this area includes advocacy for job training, permanent extension of the research and development tax credit, incentives for business to stay on American soil, and seeking to prevent unwarranted outsourcing of U.S. jobs and technologies. As a 25-year member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you have advocated for a strong military and an effective diplomacy. It is our pleasure to welcome Senator Christopher Dodd, recipient of the New England Council's New Englander of the Year award a couple of years ago, and again, a true New England son.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Michael, very much for that very generous, kind, and thoughtful and accurate introduction there. I appreciate that. Kind remarks. I'm always skeptical about introductions. Sometimes they can go on a lot longer than my remarks at events. I think my favorite introduction ever given by a public figure, was given many years ago. William Howard Taft was being honored at the Waldorf Astoria one night at a black tie event, and there was a very colorful member of the United States Senate by the name of Chauncey Depew, who was simultaneously the senator from New York and also the president of the New York Central Railroad. Give you an idea how times have changed a little bit in terms of ethics. And Chauncey Depew thought of himself as a great wit. And so he introduced Taft, who you may recall was not only, of course, historic because he had held both positions as president of the United States and also Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. At this point in his life, he'd retired. But he was also physically large. He was about 6'8" and weighed some 400 pounds. Anyway, Chauncey Depew concludes the introduction of Taft by saying, "It now gives me a great deal of pleasure to present to you a man who is both pregnant with integrity and pregnant with courage." Well, of course, the crowd roared its approval, gave Taft this standing ovation, and this giant of a figure slowly made his way to the podium. He waited for the noise to subside and the crowd to be reseated. And he turned to him and he said, "If it is a girl, I shall call her integrity. And if it is a boy, I shall call him courage. But if, as I suspect, it's nothing more than gas, I shall call it Chauncey Depew." So when I hear these very, very colorful introductions, so I thank you for that nice introduction. And it's nice to be in New Hampshire again, be back here. And Jim, good to be with you and New England Council members. And Politics and Eggs has a great, great tradition. And I can't thank you enough for coming out this morning to greet a fellow New Englander and give me a chance to be heard in this process, a long process, one that's beginning a lot earlier than I think that many of us would have anticipated for a number of reasons, which I'll touch upon briefly in the short remarks. And my intention here is just to share a few opening thoughts with you generally, and then what I'd prefer to do, if it's permissible here, is to get to the questions, and rather than trying to anticipate what you may be interested in, to wait and hear your questions as they come up. But it's worthwhile to note and talk about it, certainly, and I appreciate Michael's invitation to discuss the issue of the first in the nation's primary. And I don't say it merely because I'm here. Having been through the process over the years, I believe that this state provides a very, very valuable function for the country. Opportunities such as this, where you can sit down and have a breakfast with a gathering of people who will ask questions that are not only parochial in nature, but national and international in scope, really is a wonderful opportunity for the country. You, in a sense, are surrogates for the nation by giving us a chance to have the more detailed, informed conversation, which are watched. This morning, this conversation is being watched not just by people who will cover this event for New Hampshire, but nationally as well. So they get a chance to see those of us who seek the highest office in the land, to get to know us on a level that would not otherwise be permissible if this were merely done at a wholesale level at 35,000 feet. So I stand here before you this morning deeply committed to the first in the nation primary being in the state of New Hampshire. This is where it ought to be. It's performing a great function. And so I'll support that. And I want you to know it's not just rhetoric, but when the issues were raised, Kathy Sullivan called me back last year sometime when this was being raised at the Democratic National Committee, and I called my National Committee people from Connecticut and asked them to join with New Hampshire to be part of that effort to make sure that this would be preserved for all of us. He says, "I don't buy into the notion." Let me just touch on this briefly for you here. And I mentioned it to you already, but the notion that this process allows someone like me to be considered, quite frankly. I don't think yet people want to believe that this race is over with in February of 2007. That you would want to see who these other candidates are. What do they stand for? What do they believe in? What would they do if elected to the presidency? How would they help lead the country and get us back on track again? So this inevitability, I think, is somewhat offensive to people in the sense that they'd like to see who else has something to say. You give us that chance. You give someone like me, who is not as well known as others, a chance to be heard, to talk about the things I care about. So I'm very grateful to the people of New Hampshire. In other states, Iowa does the same in its caucuses, and these other states provide that opportunity for us actually to be heard. Then there's a time for the rest of the country, obviously, to express its opinions as well. So I truly do look forward to the chance to be up here. My plans to be here quite frequently. And just to give you some idea about whether or not the inevitability of these decisions based on early predictions. I love someone the other day sent me some polling data from 1991 and 2003, which I'll share with you. On September 26, 1991, the person who was in 6th place, 14 weeks before the first caucuses or primaries, at 2% in the polls, was a fellow by the name of William Jefferson Clinton. In 2003, the John Kerry was, I think, at 4% in the polls, some 4 weeks before the first caucuses or primaries, 1 point behind Al Sharpton in that race. So with people who tell you a year away here that these races have already been decided, my advice is go back and do a little history, and you'll determine, I think, that people had a different point of view by the end of a process than they may have had at the very, very beginning. So with that background, let me tell you why I'm doing this. Why did I decide, after 25 years in the Senate, to step forward and place my name for consideration of this nomination and the presidency? Let me state the obvious, I think, to many of us here. I think the stakes have never been higher, in my view. I think there's so much at risk over what happens here at home and around the world. I think all of us sense that to one degree or another. Obviously, the events that are the subject of the debates in Congress these days on Iraq and Iran, certainly the great worry here at home that while things are good in the short term, there's a sense that maybe in the longer term, the underpinnings of our economy could be stronger. Whether or not we've got that kind of prosperity and optimism about how things are moving in the right direction for our country is raising some legitimate concerns about what we need to be doing as a nation. So with that as a backdrop, I'm the father of 2 very young children. I'm a first-time father, in fact. I've got a 5-year-old and a 2-year-old. I'm the only guy I know of that gets mail from AARP and diaper services, I point out that to people here as a result of being a father of these young children. But those of you who are parents and are grandparents, obviously what most of us care about, while we worry about our own lives, obviously, is what kind of a life, what kind of futures do our children going to have? What kind of a nation are we going to leave them, you and I? This is our turn, in a sense, you and I. Whether you be a business leader, a labor leader, an academician, a United States senator, we're going to be judged collectively, you and I, whether or not we were able to sustain and perpetuate this wonderful, remarkable place called America. Its role here at home and abroad is largely going to be determined about the decisions, around the decisions that you and I make as a generation. So it's very important, it seems to me, given the seriousness of this time, how much is at stake here, the sense of urgency. People say, well, why did this primary process start as early as it has? I think it's because people are so upset and nervous about where we're going in some directions. They're already beginning to talk about what's next, who's saying anything that can be important for us here. I think that's contributed to the fact that there's already a heightened degree of interest in the presidential politics of 2008. I think the issues, basically looking at the candidacies, are going to be certainly leadership. Can this person, whoever it's going to be, lead us in a direction both at home and abroad that's going to give us a sense of confidence and optimism about our future? Is it a person of some proven abilities in terms of how do we come together as a people? We can't survive 51-49 much longer, I would tell you, in this room today. If we continue on this road of being a divided people, I think it's going to be very difficult for us to really step forward and make the kind of decisions we need to do on some major, major questions that confront us as a people. Certainly the debate in Congress today about the Iraq War. I'm sort of a minority of one, and I say this with great respect for my colleagues, but the idea we're spending day after day debating over debating on a resolution that has no legal effect whatsoever is a source of tremendous frustration for the American public. Whatever your view may be on the war in Iraq, we have an obligation, it seems to me, to start to make some decisions about this, rather than really arguing with each other over whether or not we can pass a resolution that has no effect whatsoever legally. The president knows what he wants to do. I think the American public have a pretty good idea of what they'd like to see. Those in Congress, it seems to me, need to have that kind of debate and come to some conclusions about this. Something with teeth in it, something with some accountability, if we're going to move forward with any kind of clarity. And that proven ability to be able to get things done. I think experience does matter. I think it's always mattered. I think this time it's going to matter even more. People want to know that you know how to do this. You know how to bring people together, to solve problems, to come up with compromises and ideas that can truly deal with some of the underlying economic and international questions that we face. And over the years, I've done that as a member of the Foreign Relations Committee, the Banking Committee, the Labor Committee, things like the Family and Medical Leave Act that many of you talked to me about over the years. It took 7 years through 2 presidential vetoes to convince my colleagues and an American president that providing people with some relief at a time of a family crisis or the birth of a new child to be able to be with them without losing their jobs. That's the kind of direction I thought our country needed to take, and you need leadership that knows how to bring people together to get that done. So I think leadership, experience, certainly a sense of confidence and optimism, and also clearly a vision of where we need to be going. Now let me just mention, if I can, very quickly, on the war in Iraq, it seems to be here that we need to have a new policy here. I spent time there, gone over a number of times over the last several years. Diplomacy clearly needs, and politics, need to be back in the forefront of all of this. I was sitting talking with Jim, and I used the words that he did as well. A surge in diplomacy is really what's necessary here. It's disappointing to me that we've sort of allowed the word diplomacy to become a pejorative in a way, that this is somehow a sign of weakness for our country, for those who might reach out to those we have serious disagreements with, to find out if there isn't some commonality of purpose that might allow us to come together to come up with a better answer than merely being a referee in a civil war in Iraq. The idea of placing 17,000 young Americans in large urban centers in the middle of where you have 23 militias today we know of operating, not to mention various insurgent groups, Ba'athist, Al-Qaeda elements, and expect them to sort out a civil war in that country is asking way, way too much in my view. And I don't think it's possible for them to resolve that kind of an issue. I think what they could do is provide border security, certainly training for these Iraqis that need the skill levels to provide the stability in their country, deal with counterterrorism, if you will, get some troops into Afghanistan where we clearly need to have some additional help along the way if we're going to be successful and not allowing the Taliban to come back and control there, but clearly a different approach. I'm not suggesting that we pack up everybody tomorrow and leave. There are functions we can perform there, but the hour has arrived when the Iraqi people themselves have to decide whether or not they want to be a country. There's not a treasury deep enough or an army big enough that's going to guarantee that for them if they don't decide themselves this is what their future is going to be. And that's the moment we've arrived at today, it seems to me. So instead of digging that hole deeper and deeper and deeper, we clearly need a new strategy here to start moving us in a different direction. And I'm worried about Iran, and I'm worried about Syria. But I also know there are interests there that we have in common, and we ought to be reaching out to see if we can't establish some way to get them involved in the political, diplomatic solutions to that region. Again, I'm not suggesting it's going to happen overnight, but you've got to begin that process. Jim Baker and Lee Hamilton, the Baker-Hamilton report, provided that kind of leadership in the country last December. I thought it was wrong-headed to just neglect and ignore the recommendations of 10 serious Americans who had spent the last 10 months evaluating what the best course of action was for us to follow. Lastly, I'll just say this to you. What I alluded to at the outset of these remarks. These 2 young daughters of mine that I have. Grace was born 2 days after 9/11. In fact, she was almost due on 9/11 in Washington. And so she was named Grace for a couple of reasons. First of all, both of her grandmothers were named Grace. We thought that was a good place to begin. But also, we thought the world could use a little grace in the midst of that event that so changed the lives of all of us and has and will probably forever for us. But my little daughter Grace, back several months ago, asked me the following 2 questions. One morning as she was getting ready to go off to her preschool. She said, "Daddy, what sort of a day do you think I'm going to have?" I thought that was a brilliant question of this 4-year-old, and clearly already her application at Harvard is in with that kind of a question. And then she asked me the following question. About 30 seconds later, she said, "Daddy, what sort of a life do you think I'm going to have?" Well, after I picked my jaw up off the floor with that kind of a profound question from a 4-year-old or 5-year-old, I'm sure it's the same question many of you have asked yourselves over and over again. What sort of a life are children going to have? What responsibilities do we have to try and get this right for them? As those daughters of mine or your children, your grandchildren will certainly ask you the same questions that I presume mine will. What did you do at the outset of the 21st century to get this on track? I want to see our country lead again in the world. I think the world wants us to lead again in the world, to become the responsible voice, the responsible source of direction that will offer some real hope and opportunity for people. I want to see us create economic opportunity for people here at home, where you have a chance to crawl up that ladder. I appreciate Michael mentioning the thing I've said a million times over in my own state, that there's no better social program in the world than a decent paying job that offers people that sense of independence, that sense of self-worth, that gives that family cohesiveness and a sense of opportunity and optimism about their futures. That ought to become our collective responsibility, to to try and get this right for them. So when that judgment is rendered, when they look back on us and say, you know, in a difficult time, in a broken time in many ways, that generation of Americans left us in as good a shape as the country they inherited when they assumed the responsibility. So again, I appreciate immensely the Politics and Eggs, the Political Library, Michael, and of course the New England Council for inviting me to come by this morning. I plan on being here many, many times over the coming 10 or 11 months, and I think New Hampshire will give a guy from Connecticut a decent chance. Thank you for listening this morning. Appreciate it very much. What a young. Thank you. And now some questions, if you got them here this morning. Who's the first brave soul here? Yes, sir.
So, what are your thoughts on Iran?
Well, the question is, what are the thoughts on Iran? And look, I'm worried about them, obviously, here. The potential, obviously, of accumulating weapons, nuclear weapons, is a serious, serious issue. They've clearly been involved in the issue, in the war in Iraq. You must understand, because I'm sure you know that over the years during the Saddam Hussein regime, many Iraqis were living in Iran. These relationships go back some time. I was briefed back in 2005 about these IEDs that were coming out of Iran. This was not news in many ways. In fact, the military showed us what was coming in, and how much more lethal they were than the ones that were homegrown in Iraq at the time. So I'm worried about where Iran is going. But I also happen to know that the only center of power is not the presidency of that country, and Ahmadinejad. You've got other powers of center that are much more influential. One of the things you've got going for us in Iran, it's one of the few countries in the world where a substantial majority of the population happen to support and like the United States of America. That's not an insignificant factor in terms of our ability to deal with that country. Now, again, there are a lot of differences we have to grapple with here, and certainly the rhetoric they've used, that the president has in talking about the Holocaust and others, are horrifying. But my view is it's worth the effort to start to explore whether or not there's some common interest here in having a stable situation in Iraq. I don't agree, and I was disappointed to see that there was jumping on this reports about the presence of these IEDs as necessarily coming from the highest leadership in the country. It seems to me that was beginning to raise a drumbeat for the use of military force in Iran. If that's going to happen, I think Congress ought to insist upon an authorization coming out of the presidency and approval by Congress before we go forward here. I would not ever suggest to you that we exclude the use of military force at all. But drawing that arrow out of our quiver prematurely, I think, could be tremendously dangerous and further inflame a region that's already posing serious, serious issues for us. So I would again like to see us explore the opportunities to find out whether or not there's some commonality of purpose here that could bring us some support. You remember, Iran was very helpful in dealing with Afghanistan and the Taliban. This is a Shia country. They're very nervous about having Sunni dominance in Iraq. And so they're, I think, anxious to have some stability there as well. But you're only going to find that out if you begin a process here to determine whether or not something could be arranged here. Again, diplomacy is not a favor to anyone. This is not a gift to anyone. Good, solid, robust, muscular diplomacy can really advance the interests of your country. And I think Baker and Hamilton were right in suggesting the administration ought to be more forthcoming in pursuing that avenue. Okay. What else? Yes, sir.
First of all, forgive me, I'm stunned that we both share a preschooler.
Yeah.
Surely you know how difficult it is, frankly, to get a senator elected these days. I think the last one was Jack Kennedy. As somebody who's been in Washington for so long, and for so many middle-class families who feel like the process has been hijacked by special interests, the same question could be asked of John Kerry 3 years ago. How are you part of the solution to really solving these problems and not maybe part of the problem having been in Washington for so long?
Well, first of all, I think it's not just about having been there. What did you do while you were there, in a sense? If it's just looking at what office you've held, that doesn't instruct very much, it seems to me. Again, I mentioned to you, I think experience does matter here in many, many ways. Not just going through a briefing book, but actually having been through the process and knowing how to make things move and happen are very, very important. On every major piece of legislation I've been involved in, landmark legislation, I've always had Republican counterparts on every single one of them. I mentioned the Family and Medical Leave Act. It was Dan Coates and Kit Bond. When I did the child care legislation, I did it with Orrin Hatch of Utah. When I did the Private Securities Litigation Reform Bill, I did it with Phil Graham. When I did the Help America Vote Act, I did it with Mitch McConnell. These are issues that were cutting edge in some ways. When I started with Family and Medical Leave, I think I had 4 or 5 votes to begin with. And it took, as I said, 7 years and 2 presidential vetoes to build the majorities for it. I think that kind of leadership is going to be critical in the coming years. If we're going to deal with big-ticket issues, not the small-bore politics that I think have caused a lot of the frustration that people feel, then it's going to take that kind of ability to bring elements together. I say this to you as an example. If I'm elected and sworn in on January 20th, 2009, the next night I may very well invite John Warner or Mitch McConnell, invite people like Orrin Hatch, along with Teddy Kennedy and Tom Harkin, and possibly Max Baucus to come down for dinner at the White House. I'm not meeting them for the first time. I've dealt with them for a quarter of a century. We've worked together on issues of common interest on here. I think that's going to be critical to starting to get things done here that people want to see. So the idea that because of job I've held over the years, and I would argue as well, we've had people who've been senators, certainly Harry Truman and Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon in his first term, certainly, and others who've demonstrated while they didn't come directly out of the Senate, certainly used that experience to do things that were very significant during their terms of office in the presidency. So the idea that you've held one office before, I don't think in any way ought to, because history didn't come right out of the Senate, ought to indict you in any sense at all. And frankly, this time around, I think international relations are going to be critical. This idea of stovepiping issues, domestic and foreign, are over with. You talk about energy policy. Is that a domestic issue or an international issue? Is equality education in this country a local issue or is it an international issue? Is the kid in New Hampshire, the child growing up here, going to be competing with a kid in Hartford or Bridgeport? Or is he or she going to be competing with a child in Johannesburg and Beijing and Moscow and Sydney? The realities are, obviously, it's going to be much broader than any of us can even imagine. It already is. In fact, that window is closing very quickly. If you read the National Academy of Sciences study about math and science, we don't have a lot of time. What I said at the outset here, the stakes are high. That's not just rhetoric. I believe it very, very deeply. We have a limited amount of time to get this right, my friends. And if we don't, this country will change dramatically before your very eyes. Read that report by the National Academy of Sciences. That's their language. The change will be abrupt if we don't begin to move aggressively to start to move on these issues of education and energy policy, health care, and the like. So I think where you've come from is interesting, but what you've done in the job you've held, I think, is going to be a more important test. Yes, sir.
You sparred with the Fed chairman this week on subprime mortgage lending.
Yeah.
Why is this such a big issue? Can you explain that to the audience here? What is the implications of that? And do you think, a year from now, this is going to be on the front pages of newspapers and Senate committees are going to be dragging some of these lending companies in front of them and bringing charges against them?
Well, I won't go that far yet, but it's an important issue. Let me first of all say I'm a great advocate of subprime lending. I think there's a danger here that people are going to associate that language with predatory lending. They're very different things here, and it's important. I know some of you here are in the financial services industry, and it's important that you understand, that I understand the difference between the two here, between subprime lending and predatory lending. There's a different regulatory scheme, in a sense here, that happens with subprime lending and predatory lending. I've written back months ago, along with a bipartisan group of us on the banking committee, again an example of bringing people together, a letter to the respective federal agencies asking them what they're doing about this inequality, if you will, of a regulatory scheme here. And the answer we got back, by the way, 2 days ago, was we're thinking about it. Well, that's not a very, as I said to Chairman Bernanke, that's not a very satisfactory answer that you're thinking about it at a time like this. I'd rather have the regulators step up and try and do something about this rather than trying to legislate necessarily in this area, given the complexity and difficulties of doing that. The danger is the following. We're told that there may be as many as 2 or 2.5 million homeowners that are going to be foreclosed out of their residences because of these outrageous second mortgages or first mortgages that they've acquired as a result of predatory practices, where those brokers are acting as if they were a financial advisor to the customer or the borrower, when in many cases they're obviously not doing that. And of course, when these are bundled and securitized, that broker or the lending institution is basically out of it after about 10 or 12 weeks. The consumer is sitting there holding a mortgage in some cases that's in excess of their fixed income, since many of them prey on people who are retired, and of course given rather high ratings. So I'm very interested in having the federal agencies look at this, and again making it possible for some sort of a regulatory practice here that would have an equal and level playing field. The subprime lender is going to be hurt by this if something isn't done soon. And again, I emphasize the subprime lending has been terrific. Look, almost 70% of Americans own their own homes today. That's an incredible piece of good news for the country, and we ought to celebrate that. I just want to make sure we don't have a lot of people get damaged and hurt by a practice here that's taking advantage of them. Okay? What else? Don't miss an opportunity to pick on a senator, you know. Yeah. Yes, sir.
The second half of the national news over the last 3 or 4 weeks, there's a theme of cuts in domestic programs. Student loans, student aid is one. I heard recently that VA benefits were being curtailed or reduced. And last night I heard that the war on cancer was going to be, the funding for that was going to be cut by $30 million. Do these cuts in domestic issues represent opportunity costs because of the money we're spending in Iraq?
Well, in part, certainly. I mean, and of course, the money in Iraq is being spent off budget. This is one of the great outrages in many ways. It's all been emergency spending, so we haven't had really a debate in Congress on the budget at all on these issues. And one of the things I hope we do is get this back on budget, so we have a debate about these monies and how they're being spent. You're underwriting and financing this in a way that's not been the way it ought to be done. Harry Truman would be horrified over the fact that you ask people to support something here and then don't have a process in place that allows them to be heard about whether or not they want to continue to support funding levels along those lines. And look, we've got some serious debate occurring because of the size of the deficit now. Again, I've always, the assumption that Republican administrations have always been fiscally responsible is certainly being debunked here. We actually had a debate back in 2001 in the Senate Banking Committee about the negative implications of retiring the national debt. Sounds quaint now, I suppose, to people here, but that actually was a discussion. Alan Greenspan came and talked to us about the negative possible fallout of retiring the national debt here. Here we're now talking about in the trillions of dollars. We've accumulated more debt in the last 6 years than all of the previous administrations combined over the history of the country. And those children of mine or yours or your grandchildren, that's a tax on them. That's a birth tax on them that they'll be asked to pay, not to mention the fact that a lot of this debt is being bought by people offshore who don't necessarily have the interests of the United States at heart. So I'm deeply troubled by the fact that this administration has dug such a deep hole for us fiscally that it's going to take a long, long time for us to come out of this. So clearly in the process here of how we balance these interests is going to be important. I happen to support a pay-as-you-go process and have for many years. I offered a pay-as-you-go budget some 23 years ago on the floor of the United States Senate. I got 20 votes, I think, or 25 votes for it at the time, during the Reagan administration, by the way. And while I don't want to hold it so rigidly that you can't do things you may need to do here, the idea that you have to pay for things that you want to do is something that I think ought to be very much a part of the budgetary process here, and I'm hopeful that'll come in short order. And obviously these other issues like education and health care are going to be important, and my hope is that we'll find the means or the ability creatively to be able to be far more supportive of supporting these critical elements for economic growth, education being a critical one in my view. And given the rising cost of education at the private and public institutions, this is going to be a major, major issue for us to make sure we don't discriminate against those who've done everything right and are prepared to go on and don't do so because of the financial limitations. Last year, I'm told somewhere between 200 and 250,000 students in the United States graduated from high school, accepted to an institution of higher learning, and did not go because of the cost. That cannot continue to happen. If this country believes it's going to grow and be stronger in the 21st century and not have a well-educated population, we are deluding ourselves. Jefferson said some 200 years ago, any nation that expects to be ignorant and free expects what never was and never possibly can be. If that was true in the beginning of the 19th century, then certainly as is the outset of the 21st century, it's going to be more important to us. So I'm hopeful that we'll find creative ways to deal with these issues. But the fiscal irresponsibility is making it very, very difficult for us. Appreciate you raising it. Yes, sir, way in the back.
Senator, funny that you should mention the national debt. The U.S. Comptroller General was in town this week talking about what he called running what he called a fiscal wake-up tour, and warning that we were headed for a financial and fiscal train wreck in 40 or 50 years if we didn't take action now to address the federal debt, the national debt. What direct actions would you propose to address that? He clearly stated that the entitlement programs were the problem and not other spending.
Well, I mentioned one thing. It's obviously the pay-as-you-go approach, I think, makes some sense to put some discipline into the process here along the way so you get real accountability. I think that's a good place to begin. Had we done that a number of years ago, I think we'd be in a very different position. We'd have those debates about whether or not you actually wanted to pursue various policies knowing you're going to have to pay for them along the way. And I don't disagree on the entitlement issues. Clearly some things need to be done, Social Security, Medicare, clearly. We've got to work at that if we're going to be able to manage and so that those programs will be available for people coming down the road. and certainly on Social Security, doing something with income levels. You don't need the kind of draconian suggestions here to make this work better and have a program available for people by the year 2040 or 2050 as they talk about it. It's important to state as well, there's not something occurring tomorrow, but I don't disagree. It's always wiser to begin the process to work forward. The last time we did that was because we had an American president and we had political leadership in the country that sat down and figured they'd figure it out and do something. A guy named Ronald Reagan and a guy named Tip O'Neill, who back in the early 1980s sat down and said, let's figure out what needs to be done here and bring people together to inject some sanity and sensibility in the process. That's exactly what I'm talking about here. You've got to have that kind of political ability and a willingness to be able to bring people together to sit down and come up with the answers here. And certainly you can argue about various formulations and how you do that in the Medicare and Social Security program, and there are a number of ideas that don't involve privatization of the programs. We ought to be encouraging, in my view, certainly more people to participate in their long-term financial security. I offered individual retirement account legislation, again, more than 20 years ago, and people who are poor will take advantage of that if you provide the incentives for them to do so. Merrill Lynch did a study years ago as a result of one of the IRA bills we put in that proved that people with incomes of $20,000 a year would take out an IRA on April 14th. They wouldn't do it earlier because they didn't have the disposable income, but with that financial incentive, that tax incentive, we're contributing to their long-term financial security. We need to do more of that, in my view, to supplement these programs that are not going to be as strong or as viable, maybe in some ways, as we might like them to be down the road. So those are various things I think we could do to answer the question. Yes, sir, over here.
Senator, when I hear you speak,
You get excited and you want to support me.
in addition to that,
Yes.
when I hear you speak, as I did in Nashville a few weeks ago, you project a sense of optimism for the country's future that is not necessarily shared, it doesn't seem, perhaps, by some of your competitors for the nomination. So I wanted to ask you, if you would, what your reaction to that is.
Well, look, I wish more of my colleagues, not that I suggest everyone run for president. I mean, I realize that would overwhelm a place like New Hampshire, I suppose. But it's a wonderful thing to get out around the country. We don't do it as often as we should, to actually meet people all across this nation of ours. And when you do, you come away with an incredible sense of optimism. There's incredible strength in this country. I've mentioned the difficulties, and you could recite a list longer than probably I have to this morning about the reason to be concerned about where things are headed. But I happen to believe that if you really listen carefully to what people are suggesting, their ideas, their sense of hope, you can't help but be more optimistic and confident. I often say to people who are running for office, whether it's a local office or a national office, there's a question that people ask us all the time that they never really articulate, but it's the most important question that someone running for public office ever gets. And the answer to the question largely determines whether or not they'll support you. And the question is not what are your views on health care, education, or fiscal policy, as important as they are. Don't minimize them. The question is the following. Mr. or Mrs. Candidate, are you listening to me? Do you know what I'm going through? Do you know what it's like to raise a family? Do you know what it is to worry about whether or not you got your job the next day? Do you have any idea of who I am? Are you paying any attention to me? And they don't ask the question directly, but that is the question. There's a great anecdote that I learned years and years ago when I first ran for Congress. And I've told this story a number of times. I've often said at the end of my public life, if this could be said about me, it would be the best monument I could ever receive. And it's the story of Franklin Roosevelt's casket being carried down Pennsylvania Avenue in April of 1945. And there's a crowd, obviously 7 deep, 10 deep. A reporter covering the event is interviewing people on their recollections and memories of Franklin Roosevelt. And one individual seems more grief-stricken than the rest, and so the reporter assumes that this person knew Roosevelt. So he walks up, he said, how well did you know President Roosevelt? He said, I didn't know him at all. He said, well, why do you seem more grief-stricken than the rest? And he says, I didn't know him, he knew me. And I thought, what a credible thing to say, that an American president knew who this guy was. And that's what made him different to him, that he knew who he was. This guy from Hyde Park who had a life very, very different than the people he tried to lead during the Great Depression and the World War. And I've often said, if that can be said about anyone in public life, it's a pretty good testimony to your service. And so if you listen to people carefully and pay attention to what they're telling you here, it's a primal response in many ways. And then if you decide that I am listening to you, then you're going to be interested in what programs I may have that may get us moving in a different direction. And as I hear people in this country, I hear a voice of optimism and confidence. I hear people worried about where things are going, but I simultaneously hear that voice that says we can get this right. I'll tell you one more story about this. I worry terribly about where we're going as a country. In Michael's introduction, I don't know if he mentioned the fact that back in the 1960s, when I finished Providence College, I went off and joined the Peace Corps in Latin America, served in the Dominican Republic on the Haitian border. I've been asked 1,000,000 times why I did it. And the answer I've given 1,000,000 times over is very simple. Someone asked me to. Someone asked a generation of us to be involved in something larger than ourselves. And so as a result of that request, in a way, that challenge, many of us went off and did different things and came back, changed people as a result of that experience. I meet with Peace Corps volunteers everywhere I go if I travel. I offer them food and meals. They come out. They don't want to see a senator, but they're hungry, so I feed them. They have very little incomes coming in. And we have Peace Corps programs only in 2 of the Arab countries in the world. Of the 22 Arab countries, we have a Peace Corps program in Jordan and Morocco. I'm trying to get a Peace Corps program in Egypt and elsewhere. I think one of the things we need to do is become more familiar with the Muslim world, more Arabic speakers, more people who are knowledgeable about that part of the world. But nonetheless, I met with 20 Peace Corps volunteers in Jordan a few months ago that are all retired. They'd finished their 2 years. All of them fluent Arabic speakers. All of them had very positive experiences, 13 of them going on to graduate school when they come back. But I asked them the question I presume all of you would have asked them if you were sitting there having lunch with them. How are we doing? What do people think about the United States? These are people who are not diplomats. They've been serving in little villages or neighborhoods in Amman and elsewhere. And I expected them to say, you're in deep trouble here. The United States is really despised and hated because of the Palestinian-Israeli issues or the war in Iraq. The answer unanimously among all of them was, no, no. There's still great, great hope. There's great admiration for the United States. I wish you could have heard them coming back. That it's not a lost cause at all. Yeah, they're disappointed. Yes, we've got serious problems. And yes, people are angry over certain policies. But I believe very deeply the world wants to see the United States lead again. We just need to get out there and start doing it, being constructive. And I'm not talking about being loved everywhere, but start rebuilding those relationships. Start reestablishing those rules of international behavior that we authored. We were the architects of after World War II. I mentioned Nuremberg. My father was the Nuremberg trials with Robert Jackson. I grew up at a dining room table with my 5 siblings where I heard all about the rule of law growing up and how important it was. My father believed, as I do, that while certainly a military buildup contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union, it was the absence of a rule of law in those countries that has much to do with the collapse of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. People who lived in those countries had as much to do with the undoing of that system as any external threat they faced at all. And to watch the United States today begin to move away from the rule of law, the vote that we took last fall on this Military Commissions Act, to walk away from habeas corpus, to walk away from the Geneva Conventions, to suggest that torture could be a permissible means by which we extract information, was a dark, dark day, in my view. We belong to a much better country than that. We ought to stand up for the Constitution. We ought to stand up for the rule of law and be heard on these issues. Thanks again. And well, thank you again for that. But I believe that optimism is there. We just need to tap into it. For me to get that, I get wound up on some of these. Yes, how are you?
I'm good. Good morning, Senator.
I like that Dodd button you got.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to see you here. You
just want to advertise that.
Yeah. No, you came by my high school on the morning of the 2004 elections on your way to the polls because we live in the same town back in Connecticut.
There we go.
And I always remembered that, and I thought it was very sincere. And I enjoyed your remarks then, and I've enjoyed them this morning. But my question for you is, you mentioned your support of the New Hampshire First in the Nation primary, but Hillary has said that she will, of course, continue to campaign in New Hampshire regardless of DNC rules. Will you continue to do so if the DNC throws any rules or regulations your way?
Absolutely. I'm gonna live here. You're gonna see me so you're gonna be so sick of me up here. I'll tell you. Along the way, and it's listen. I enjoy it. This is a remarkable process to go through, and it can be tiring and exhausting, but it's exhilarating as well. To hear good people who care about the country, and in my own state of Connecticut, I literally over the years have spoken at every single public high school in my state to go around juniors and seniors, so they get a chance to see a United States Senator and ask questions and talk with you. So for those of us who come from smaller states, the idea of engaging what we call retail politics is something that we're familiar with, and I've enjoyed it immensely. And young man went to East Haddam High School, Hale Ray High School in a little town I live in. I live in an old schoolhouse on the banks of the Connecticut River, about an hour and a half from here, so it's very easy to get to New Hampshire, and I'll be up quite frequent. What else? Anything else? Are we doing on time? Yes, hey, Fran, how are you?
You're the voice of a woman here.
Yes, I think that's right.
Would you support public financing to begin with federal elections?
Yeah, there is. In fact, we have a program, you know, for presidential races. I know people are opting out of it right and left, and there's a suggestion about getting some more resources back. I would tell you, this is so troubling to me about what's happening and the cost of campaigns. And it isn't just, obviously, the presidential race or statewide races, but it's, in effect, limiting the pool of people who might step forward. I'm very worried. You know, the days at the founding of our republic when you had to be a white male that owned property to participate in the electoral process of the nation is obviously long over with. But in some ways, we're getting back to a de facto situation where only people who have the personal wealth themselves or access to it. The question that was raised earlier about whether or not you actually can, the interest that can overwhelm a system here is something I worry about all the time. I've been an advocate of public financing of campaigns. Change the Constitution if you have in some ways. The idea that money is speech, I think, was one of the worst decisions we reached in the Supreme Court. I think money allows you to have a bigger voice box. And as an advocate of free speech, the idea that we limit or don't limit the ability of people to have some control over this process is deeply worrying to me. And it isn't, I'd say, just even statewide offices. The costs of running for a local office are getting overwhelming. And I'm worried that we're excluding an awful lot of people from being a part of it. So I'm a strong advocate of finding some ways here to make it possible, once again, for people to participate in the process. And hopefully that'll come. Yes, sir.
Senator, I think a lot of us think about electability, perhaps more than anything else. We may love you here in New Hampshire, but the question is, will they love you in New Mexico or Nevada or South Dakota or South Carolina? You might not want to show your hand, but what's your strategy for selling yourself in other parts of the country, which may be a little different than the Northeast?
Well, you know, I'm 62 years of age. This is not a warm-up for some future run for me here. I am who I am here. This is I'm not going to go through some metamorphosis for you in the process. So I don't give a different speech in different places. And I don't think people want to hear it. I think the word authenticity has been used a lot over the years to talk about this, but I think it still rings true in a sense. You know, the answer I don't know is not a bad answer. I know people don't like to give it, or that we disagree is okay too, in a way. We're not all going to agree on things at all. In fact, the issues that I may confront as your president someday are ones that we can't even imagine sitting around at a breakfast table here this morning in New Hampshire. And so you're making decisions about character, about whether or not this person has the experience, the background, the proven ability, and the sense of judgment that will be in that seat making decisions that could affect the lives and well-being of this country and the world in which we live. And so my mission when I got, and frankly the good news is I go around and have to all these states, I find that coming from New England, this idea is not, I don't think it's a liability. I think people would care less where you're from, in a sense. This ocean somehow, because you're from a certain part of the country. Anyone who's ever looked back at elections and say, why did so-and-so lose? It was never because of where they were from. Either they connected with people or they didn't. Either there was a sense of being authentic and sincere and held views they were willing to share with people, even when you disagreed, I think is what is more important to people. And in the past, I think that's been the reason why we've succeeded or failed as candidates from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, for that matter. I always say Democrats never understood Ronald Reagan terribly well. One of the reasons the country supported him as often as they did, even with people who disagreed with him fundamentally on issues, when they'd examine his views on the issues and their views, he still did well. One of the reasons is because Ronald Reagan had a wonderful sense of confidence and optimism, and secondly, he had a sense of direction. And he'd say to people, I'm going out that door. Now, I may go alone, but that's where I'm going. And if you'd like to come, I'd like to have your company. But that's what I believe in very deeply, and you need to know that. And that's a very reassuring quality in people in public life, in my view, that you have a sense of direction, a sense of purpose, you have a vision, and a sense of goals you'd like to achieve for the constituency you seek to represent. So I'm not worried at all. I think I can do very well in these other states because I don't think they're any different in South Carolina, Nevada, Iowa, or any other state than they are in Connecticut or New Hampshire. People want straight answers, they want what you believe in, and they want to know where you're going to take us as a country. And I welcome the opportunity to explain that to people. Thanks. How are we doing here? Listen, I'll stay for lunch if you'd like. I mean, I understand here. Here. Well, thank you all very, very much. You've been very generous with your time and your questions, and I look forward to seeing all of you in the coming weeks and months. Thank you very, very much. Very pleasant.
Now we're going to present this mug to you. Senator, we just want to thank the senator for stopping by and giving his candid and yet passionate remarks on how he feels about the issues. Needless to say, you know why the New England Council decided to give him New Englander of the Year, because of his advocacy on these so important issues on behalf of New England. And that's what we enjoyed working with the senator, is that he had the perspective of working on behalf of all of New England, day in and day out. And as you go through your journey here in New Hampshire and spending day and night here, you may need a large cup of coffee. And here is a mug, and we're going to get a mug shot very shortly. But we want to thank you, Senator, for all that you do on behalf of New England. We wish you luck in your journey, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much.
Very nice. Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much. Michael, thanks very much. Danny. Appreciate it very, very much. Good travel. Perfect. Good travel. We'll see you again. Thanks.
New Hampshire Public Television is proud to be a production partner of this Politics and Eggs webcast and the Video Archives Project. Politics and Eggs is a project of the New Hampshire Political Library and the New England Council, with support from BAE Systems, Clean Harbors Environmental Services, and Fidelity Investments.